Hi, I'm Emilie Reed, and to briefly introduce myself and the angle that I approach studying game creation from, I'm a curator, writer, researcher, and sometimes practitioner, coming from an art history background. I recently completed a dissertation on how video game exhibitions are displayed and narrativized in the context of larger art institutions, and I'm now continuing to identify ways of studying and discussing elements of video games that are left out of these histories and ill-suited to be addressed by more typical or mainstream game studies approaches. How I became interested in this research is also kind of the story of how I became a game studies adjacent academic, so I'm going to start by going over my line of thinking there. Then I'll present examples and important aspects of 3 negative spaces, and finally wrap up with some conclusions about what could potentially come from identifying and focusing on negative spaces of game studies and the games industry, and possibilities for further research. When I began studying art history, one of my primary areas of interest was the through line from Dada and Surrealism to Fluxus, Conceptualism, and the influence these movements had on a variety of very technologically oriented ways of making art. I read Lucy Lippard's 6 Years, which is a sort of intense documentation of a short time period of conceptual art production and exhibition strategies. You can pause the video now if you want to read the whole title, which gives a good idea of its contents. When people talk about conceptual art, the focus is usually on how it played with and took a self-reflexive attitude towards art's representational and material qualities, and it was kind of about seeing how much you could challenge or reduce that. But if you read 6 Years, you find out that conceptualism was also a very important shift in how art was produced and distributed. Conceptual art was still material in that it resulted in some sort of physical substantiation, but the specificity of its material became unimportant. It became an alternative practice for many artists who did not have the time or resources to prepare canvases or sculptures in a separate studio space. It's an element of why so many women were involved and why it was a very internationally engaged movement. Instead of having to gather and arrange shipping for a collection of bulky original sculptures and paintings in the exhibition venue, the work can be printed in a magazine or instructions written on a postcard that you mail to the curator. This created new flexibility and accessibility in the creation and distribution of art. This prefigures the capabilities of digital and internet technologies and how people have used them to make and distribute interactive work, which they may or may not call video games. Institutional narratives of conceptual art have, in a way, enclosed the movement by presenting it in terms of what pieces were later able to be presented as valuable artifacts in an art market context, rematerialized into a discrete and unique thing. And I think the pursuit of this uncomplicated thingness, preferably recognizable as a default type of commodity, is also how game studies often sets the scope of what it is examining or including. What we call piracy, or obsolete, or unprofessional, or simply dismiss as not worth recognition, creates an enclosed idea of video games that is ahistorical. All of these elements were fundamental to how video games were made and distributed before an alternative was codified and enforced, usually via capital holders. So the point of this research, which is synthesizing perspectives on game production, computing history, the rules and attitudes of storefronts and publishers in the indie space, as well as aesthetic evaluation and claims about video games and play, is to look at the moments of exclusion where the games industry and video games, as we often discuss them, become distinct in their form. Focusing on these exclusions as exclusions can shed light on significant issues in the writing of gaming history, its study, and its conservation. So why take a negative approach to this? This is a good question. When you think about these things that have been excluded from gaming histories or game studies, the impulse is to make a positive case for including them based on a shared characteristic or some sort of importance, rather than drawing attention to them as exclusions. However, I want to think of alternatives to the reparative historical strategy that Linda Nochlin criticizes in her essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? She observes that the 2 most common strategies of feminist scholars were to make the case for the overlooked, neglected women artists through history, or argue for an alternate feminine greatness that women's art has. Strategies, she argues, which, by attempting to answer the question rather than examine its assumptions, tacitly reinforce its negative implications. So I think we can just as easily ask, why have there been no great RPG Maker games, or Famiclone games, or Bitsy games, where great is a level of prestige and critical attention similar to a canonical industry product. While there is the work of historical, aesthetic, social importance within all of these categories, the great or classic canonical video game, in the context of an industry where a singular commercial product is the structural norm, is not really a frame through which we can examine them. In this case, trying to expand our historical frame to hold a few canonical examples of these categories only makes their otherwise not belonging more pronounced. Arriving at this research strategy came from the existing literature expanding the remit of game studies beyond mainstream industry practices. So relevant work has considered the emergence of indie as a production classification and the influence of everyday casual or amateur game makers, ultimately arguing for, as Brandon Keogh writes, a much broader accounting of the broader field of creative practice that the formal video game industry is embedded within. I want to try going a step further than that and explicitly say that the normalized commercial video game is a very particular subset of a larger whole. Without these ongoing informal practices, the formal games industry would very quickly be unable to exist. If these practices had never existed, the industry would never emerge in the form that it has. The elements being excluded are co-constitutive of the form video games as a cultural product and the games industry currently takes. While we can make the case for some borderline cases to be conditionally included, it does not change the existing perspective and hierarchy of values. So, studying what is excluded can shed light on how artificial and constructed the idea of video games already is. There are many categories and contexts of production that could be analyzed in this way, so in this talk I'll be focusing on 3: grassroots, low-tech, and pirate game production. Grassroots tools emerge from communities rather than being imposed upon them by the demands of the industry or industry-controlled distribution networks. These tools often make a very particular type of game and provide a visual interface and a lightweight software application or web app. They allow the resulting games to be freely distributed and edited. In some cases, the tool itself is open source, which allows a community to change or add features through modding. In addition to lowering skill and cost barriers to game making, they also encourage different attitudes and goals than industry standard tools. Twine is an example of this that works at several levels. It's a free program that is widely accessible as a downloadable software or web app, and has a primarily visual interface so many more people can intuitively use it than proprietary development software or even free alternatives like Unity that are still made with an industry pipeline process in mind. But it was also able to develop such a lively culture because of the ease of hosting the output HTML files, especially through free resources like Philomela. Similarly, Bitsy is a free web app, which generally only upgrades to present its very simple, limited features in a greater variety of languages, and because its code is available to the community, has an active culture of modding and hacking in extra features as needed. Flat games are more of a style and approach to game making that can use a variety of tools or engines, but it is also currently being compiled into a freely available tool by the independent studio Dreamfeel. Many of these tools also overlap with low-tech concerns. Low-tech tools resist the cycles of rapid planned obsolescence identified in James Newman's study of the game industry Best Before. Newman evaluates console generations, remakes, and other foundational elements of the game industry as consistently drawing attention towards a speculative future of gaming, rather than any historical contemplation. Low-tech practices involve more than restoring or maintaining retro consoles, for example. They also stem from an awareness of the problematic supply chains, e-waste, and increased energy demands associated with frequent technological upgrades. New strategies in this area lead to the creation and distribution of video games becoming more accessible in contexts where internet speeds and hardware requirements that are taken for granted in locations with an official video game industry do not exist. Game-making approaches which resist a linear narrative of technological improvement can be analyzed in terms of how they revisit forgotten solutions and open up alternative histories of the form. For example, the Bitsy editor, working in small-scale, limited-color pixel art, is partially working from a retro game sensibility. However, the editor also outputs the games as lightweight HTML pages and allows the user to hack its rather readable game code, which can be exported as an even smaller text document. This makes Bitsy a low-tech option that varies importantly from other forms of game making which produce heavier or harder to preserve game files and do not offer access to readable code. Piracy can describe anything that utilizes digital distribution capacities of computing and the internet to gather materials and share work outside of official commercial context for video games. Graham Kirkpatrick notes that the construction of piracy within video games discourse was imposed by companies and professional publications on a context where code copying and sharing was previously foundational to learning how to use technology like personal computers and making one's own projects. Piracy creates resilient networks compared to the problems of inaccessibility that DRM, IP law, and capitalist demands have on the availability of video games, and has played a major role in games preservation, frequently working around these problems in creative and generative ways to restore and maintain works that would otherwise be highly limited or disappear completely. Pirate distribution networks are a norm in certain countries and online contexts, and piracy can supplement and even become a creative practice in itself. Pierre-Yves Hurel, for example, describes that within the RPG Maker community, a starting premise for many creators is to make one's own version of existing popular game franchises. I have also discussed elsewhere how the origin of the international RPG Maker community, primarily resulting from an English crack of the previously Japanese exclusive software by a Russian hacker and programmer known as Don Miguel, contribute to a culture of remix, reuse, and scrounging the internet for freely available tools, scripts, and ripped or modified sprite graphics that define much of the work in RPG Maker, in addition to its popularity and influence. Beyond this, Dongwon Zhou has also researched the centrality of pirate video game distribution to countries like Korea, and how in these contexts, copying, remaking, and adapting existing software became a highly creative pursuit in itself, a situation that is paralleled across many cultures. However, this is often one of the most difficult exclusion categories to reconsider. Despite the ways intellectual property can be easily pointed to as perversely incentivizing companies into consolidating, exploiting, locking away, and cutting off access to certain cultural property, and the ways it so often fails to reimburse or protect smaller-scale creators, despite everything, it still symbolically seems to secure the ability to be recognized and paid for creative labor. However, I think this is exactly what's wrong with how intellectual property is conceptualized and used in laws and legal actions. By creating this category, it calcifies what creative work is compensable and how, but it also creates a delineation of what creative work is outside this possibility to begin with. The idea of piracy as a perversion or obverse of video games, rather than of the video games industry specifically, should be challenged in any critique of the industry, and also incorporated into any expansion of the field of game studies beyond industry concerns. So hopefully through this presentation, I've shown how the games industry foregrounds certain abstractions and idealizations that video games are marketed as constantly moving towards, and canonizes video games and production approaches that produce work that aspires to these qualities. So if we follow the industry's perspective on what a video game is, we're already working within strict ideological limitations. The excluded qualities I discussed today instead follow game studies' material turn, working within the particular gaps that evade the lines of vision of the formalized game industry. These categories generate provocative questions about the discursive formation of video games and the video game industry, and what is often excluded from this framing. This research is still in its early stages, and I'm still looking to identify negative spaces of video games and game studies, as well as develop plans and methods for investigating and reporting on them. This is building on my previous research, examining game development tools that are associated with non-commercialized and non-professionalized approaches to game making, like RPG Maker, Glorious Trainwrecks, and Flat Games. That's why the three initial categories I proposed were grassroots, low-tech, and adjacent to piracy, or at least non-originality. However, moving forward, I want to also consider perspectives like Sonia Physic's work on idle and automated games, as well as other areas that are seen as problematic or contested in a video games context, like gambling, cheating, and non-agential or disempowering approaches to video games. Histories of these borders, where and how non-games, bad games, technological dead ends, and other exclusions of a normative history of video games are defined, takes a step beyond simply expanding the existing narratives, and instead will hopefully lead to productively reflecting on how these narratives came to be in the first place. Thank you.